So what does 1.5 degrees mean? If the temperature outside was 1.5 degrees higher or lower, it wouldn't mean we'd all be dressed in sort of Hawaiian shirts and swimwear. It would just mean we may not be wearing a scarf. So on that basis, it's relatively small. But 1.5 degrees, there's many instances in which that makes a big difference. So the difference of 1.5 degrees in your kettle will sort of will change whether the water's boiling or whether it's not boiling, and that will sort of change the quality of your cup of tea. And also 1.5 degrees, if we think about in terms of our internal temperature, could mean the difference between a human slipping in and out of hypothermia. So my brief was to give you a summary of the latest IPCC report. And I'm going to start off with a quote that followed that report. So the quote says, "We have no room to build anything that emits CO2 emissions." And at this point in time, that's the vast majority of vehicles. Now, this isn't some sort of radical eco person, but this was Fatih Birol. And I have taken the quote out of context, so he was talking about power generation. But when we're talking about electrification of vehicles, we are also talking about the decarbonization of our electricity supply. So the key question that I want to try and give some insight into today is what level of CO2 emissions reduction is required under this new report and the guidance that they offer, and by when. So where does this report come from? So back in 2015, at the Paris Climate Agreement, within the text of that agreement, it says we agreed to cut emissions so that we achieve a 2-degree temperature increase, but we will also pursue efforts to limit that temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. So that was in 2015, and at that point in time, they realized that they needed some more scientific evidence in order to make a better judgment on this. And that led to this report, this special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, which was released in October this year. So I'm going to cut straight into the key messages of the report. So the key thing is that 1.5 degrees, that global warming level, we can still keep ourselves below that. It is achievable, but the time to act is now. So there's a growing sense of urgency that has come out of this report. Humans have warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius on average across the whole world. Okay? The temperature warming across different parts of the world is not homogeneous, so some areas of the world have warmed much more quickly than this, but overall, we've already warmed the planet by 1 degree. And there are significant benefits if we do keep the level of global warming to below 1.5 degrees. But what that means is that we need net zero emissions by mid-century, so around about 2050, and that will require unprecedented, deep emissions reductions across all sectors. And in transport, that means we have to move from a low emissions energy consumption of around about 5% today to around about 35 to 65% in 2050 under different scenarios. And what the report also highlights is that our technology solutions may not be enough, and that if we just focus on technology solutions, we will also need to invest significantly in taking carbon dioxide that we've emitted into the atmosphere out of the atmosphere. So by tackling demand and demand for energy and the emissions that result from that, that would improve the likelihood that we achieve this 1.5 degree target, but it also reduces the need for this carbon dioxide removal. So there's a far greater sense of urgency within the sort of climate science community, which is propagating throughout different sectors of the economy. And I'm not going to dwell on the impact of climate change too much, because I'm not a climate scientist and I'm an engineer, so I need to sort of know that this is happening and why it's happening and why to deal with it. But at the end of the day, we need to deal with it. But just a couple of examples. So this is the Arctic, the sea ice extent. So the sea ice area across the world for the last 40 years. And the last 3 years, so 2016, 2017, and 2018, are the years with the lowest sea ice area over the last 40 years. So if you look particularly around November time, so around about where we are now, those 3 reddish lines are the most recent 3 years. This is one example of the effects of climate change being felt already. And the report lays out what the benefits of keeping global warming to below 1.5 degrees compared to a 2-degree target quite clearly. So it focuses on 5 different areas, 5 reasons for concern, they call it. So there's a unique and threatened systems, which include coral reefs, extreme weather events, which sort of anecdotally seem to be happening more frequently, the distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, large-scale singular events. And the figure here shows that if we allow our planet to warm further, the severity of those impacts gets worse. Specifically, looking at warm water corals on the left-hand side in the Arctic region, there would be significant benefits to reducing the impact on those 2 areas if we keep our warming to 1.5 degrees. So how close are we? Well, if we continue on the path that we're on, we will reach 1.5 degrees by 2040. As I say, we currently warm the planet by about 1 degree. And this green area on the chart here shows all of the different pathways that we could take in order to meet that 1.5 degree target. And one of the key take-home messages from this report is that there's no one pathway that we need to follow. There are multiple ways in which we can reach this target. So let's think about that target and think about it in terms of what climate scientists call a carbon budget. And so this says that there's a sort of an amount of carbon dioxide that we can put into the atmosphere before we reach that 1.5 degree limit. And the carbon budget, which would give us a 2/3 chance of avoiding a 1.5 degree temperature rise in 2100, is 2,770 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Right, so 67% chance. If we say we're below this budget, we've got a 67% chance. Now, personally, I think I'm a little bit risk averse because I'm slightly worried by those risks. But it's could be a long way off, so maybe we're okay. Let's find out. So we've got one planet, and we can think of our planet as a cake, or if you're from America, you can think of it as a pie. And how much of this budget have we used up? So we've currently used up, by the end of 2017, 2,200 gigatons of CO2. And that means we have around about 570 gigatons left. Okay, so the next step of our calculation is to figure out what we're currently emitting and how many years left we've got. So let's do some arithmetic. So some budget to 2100 is 2,770. We've used up 2,200, which means we have 570 left. And our current emissions rate is around about 42 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year globally. It's not showing any signs of decreasing at this stage. So if we do the division, that gives us a total number of years of 13.5 years left before we exceed our carbon budget. So we often think of climate change as being something that's very far away, something that's very long term, but this is just over a decade away. And actually there's some uncertainties, as there always is in science. In this carbon budget, there is an uncertainty range, and it could be lower than that. And this only just gives us a 67% chance. So if we eat up all of that cake and we exceed our carbon budget, what we could do is we could borrow from the future, right? So we could imagine that we have an additional planet to use up. We don't. This is called overshooting. So we emit more than our budget, and we borrow from the future, which means that that CO2 that we would emit has to then be absorbed at a later date. So we have to take it back out of the atmosphere. So there's multiple different ways and rates in which we could eat this cake. We could eat it with a teaspoon or a tablespoon, and depending on how quickly we eat that cake will depend on how much we need to take out of the atmosphere at a later date. And so there's different emissions pathways that are discussed within the report. On the left-hand side, you see a scenario where we cut emissions relatively quickly and quite steeply. And so we only need a little bit of this overshoot, but still we've got net zero emissions by 2050. And on the right-hand side is a pathway where we say, okay, let's sort of continue with our high energy and carbon-intensive lifestyles. So the decline in CO2 is much slower, and also the rate of decline is slower. But what that means is that we need more investment and more money spent on taking the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. So that could be through growing forests, through growing trees and plants that we then burn in power stations, but we capture the CO2 before it's released to the atmosphere. So those are two different ways. So in terms of the question, what level of CO2 emissions reduction is required and by when? Well, the report says that we need to cut emissions by 45% by 2030, and we need to go to a net zero emissions situation by 2050. Now that's significantly harder than our current UK 2050 target of 80% reduction in CO2. So what are the implications for transport? Well, one major one is that transport as a sector and transport activity globally is growing. And the World Bank predicts that by 2030, passenger mobility will increase by 50%, and global freight volumes will increase by 70%. So that gives us an even harder problem to crack, because we've got to reduce our total level of emissions at the same time as activity is increasing. In the UK, transport has become the largest source of CO2 emissions. So passenger cars still remain the dominant source of CO2 emissions within the transport sector. But transport, as I say, is now the largest source of CO2 compared to all other sectors. And it's been identified as one of the key risks to the UK meeting its climate change objectives. So this figure on the right-hand side is from the Climate Change Committee. And the sort of top of the green area is where we would go if we sort of continue on the pathway that we're going with a business as usual approach, and do nothing about it. But then we've got a series of policies that have been enacted. So the green area is those low-risk policies that are doing well and are reducing emissions. You can see that that's a relatively small slice. Then the yellow area is the medium-risk policies, so those policies which have some risk attached to them. The red area is really high-risk policies. So these are policies that the government's talking about, but there's a huge risk that they won't give the CO2 emissions reductions that are required. And then that hashed area is policies that we don't have yet. So we don't know yet how we're going to achieve the Climate Change Committee's dashed black line there on their cost-effective pathway to reduce CO2 emissions in transport in the UK. So there's a policy gap. One of the risks, or one of those yellow policies, relies on new car CO2 emissions being lower and improving year on year. But actually, progress in that area has stalled. So these sort of falling lines represent the targets in terms of new car CO2 across different regions around the world. And the red line is the 2017 UK new car average CO2 emissions level, which is 121 grams per kilometer. And it's increased a little bit by just under 1% compared to last year. So improvements in new car CO2 have stagnated, and this presents us with a problem. Okay, so we've fallen away. We need to be following that sort of teal color line that represents the EU targets. And in order for us to reach a 2021 target of 95 grams per kilometer, we would need to reduce that new car CO2 by around about 6% a year for every year up until 2021. So we talk about EVs and electric vehicles and how they could give us reductions in CO2 and decarbonization of transport that we need. But there are some risks associated to electric vehicles. Firstly, it relies on the fact that we have a low-carbon electricity supply. And in the UK, we are making progress towards a low-carbon electricity supply. But that presents a risk, especially when there are other competing consumers of electricity. A risk has been identified in terms of the supply side of these electric vehicles and the fact that supply isn't matching demand at the moment. And so we have fallen behind the Climate Change Committee's targets on how quickly electric vehicles are brought into the fleet. And there's also a risk about the materials used for batteries. So the International Energy Agency says that in their electric vehicle 2030 scenario, the demand for cobalt, which is used in batteries, will be increased by 25 times what it is today. So we need to reduce carbon from the transport sector, and we need to make significant cuts. There are some risks associated with just relying on cleaner vehicles. So let's sort of take a step back and understand a little bit more about how we might make those significant cuts. And so I'm going to start off with this equation, which sort of says that our transport carbon emissions on the left-hand side of the equation are a function of 4 factors, right? And it's just a multiplication of those 4 factors. So how much travel there is, or mobility, how many vehicle kilometers are traveled per unit of passenger kilometer traveled, so that's like an occupancy factor, the energy intensity, which is sort of like how energy efficient your vehicle is, and then finally the carbon intensity of the fuel that we're using. So that's how much CO2 per unit energy there is. And we can think of those 4 factors as our decarbonization levers. And we should be thinking more broadly than just increasing the energy efficiency of vehicles and reducing the carbon intensity of fuels. And my argument is that we need to be thinking more broadly. We can start thinking about how we can affect these 4 factors by thinking about travel demand, moving between different modes of transport. We can obviously think about vehicles, propulsion, and fuels, and how that can be matched to demand, how the operations could be optimized for specific vehicles and specific types of travel demand, and then how that transport need is met and services are met and how they interact with infrastructure. And we need innovation across these different levels of the transport sector. So we need systems integration, and I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of integrating across these levels and coming up with innovation across these levels. So a couple of examples why that's important, right? Firstly is that we know that cities with higher population densities also have lower CO2, so per capita, per person CO2 levels. So that's on the left-hand side. So, if we think about transport more broadly in terms of actually how we integrate transport with the design of our cities, then that can lead to benefits in terms of decarbonization. And then secondly, the other example that I want to highlight, it's a bar chart. You might not be able to read the text on here, but the 2 things I've highlighted here. This bar chart shows the potential effect on energy and CO2 that autonomous vehicles might have. And we talk about the benefits of autonomous vehicles being lower cost of travel, allowing more access to travel. Now, a disbenefit of that, or an impact of that, might be that more people travel more. And that would have a significant impact on our CO2 emissions and energy consumption. So that's one area that we need to be careful and think more integrated across the chain. And one aspect that we could consider is actually, if we've got more sort of choice around the vehicles that we're using, in an autonomous vehicle world, we don't necessarily own our own vehicle. We could think about perfectly sizing vehicles to the trip. So if there's only one person taking a trip, we could have a very small, lightweight vehicle that reduces the amount of energy required to complete that trip. There's also significant co-benefits of all of this. So we would significantly reduce congestion. We could significantly improve air quality in our cities by promoting active travel modes, we not only reduce congestion, improve air quality, but also improve the health of our citizens. And there is a huge market opportunity in terms of low-carbon vehicle technologies. And this report, commissioned by the Climate Change Committee, identified that the UK is a leader in terms of technology for low-emissions vehicles, but also supporting technologies like vehicle telematics and logistics. And if we combine those together, there's a global market in 2050 of around about 7 trillion that could be accessed. So huge opportunity from sort of thinking more broadly about how our vehicle technologies interact with our travel demand, infrastructure, and operations. Thank you.